So, in order to disambiguate, we're having a conversation around AGI and maybe about AGI risk. And
Mhm.
the first question I would ask is, and this is what do you call it? This is your quarter. I'm from that era, so quarter means one game of a stand-up video game. Um, are you interested in kind of the Eliezer Yudkowsky hard takeoff self bootstrapping risk, or are you worried about or interested in talking about the kind of the implications of adding a new layer of algorithmic intelligence, technical capacity on top of our existing sort of socio-technical infrastructure, which are different. Both are interesting, but they're not necessarily they're not the same.
Here's where I'm coming from. So one part of this is that I've been, sort of drenched in the Bukowskian, material, let's call it, since the early days. I've been on Less Wrong since like the 2010s, maybe even like 2009 or something, like, ever since it started basically. And before that, when he was on Overcoming Bias with Hansen, sort of, I've observed that material pretty well. Then I went off, started a startup, worked on that for 10 years. And then with the pandemic, I reemerged and realized a few concerning things about the rationalists, which is that, and this is completely subjective by my, like I don't, we probably don't have time for me to make my case on it. So I'll just, articulate it. But the rationalists seem to not understand feedback loops, except for the one that they are very partial to, the whole Foom thing. They also have very little understanding of building things, like real things in the real world, which you have done.
Mm-hmm.
So, the entrepreneurial philosophy, let's call it, of, actually pragmatic sort of, and then that comes back to the feedback loops, right? Sort of doing something small, adjusting, learning, doing something small, adjusting, learning, whatever. They seem to be of the sort of, you got to do it right in the beginning and press the button and it's got to go. And if it's not perfect, it's basically, the end of the world, which makes me distrust their whole reasoning. And what's worse than that is that they seem to have this weird trust in the state power as a countermeasure to artificial intelligence,
Uh-huh.
which, like, okay, I'm willing to grant a lot of their premises on AI risk. But if we're talking about unaligned agents, state power isn't doing that much better. So I'm baffled. Like I this is the part where they lose me, which is that they're talking about moratoriums on like silicon or whatever. And I'm like, again, I could see a path to getting there, but they're not doing any of the work. They're just sort of assuming a bunch of stuff, and therefore, lockdowns sort of thing.
Ah,
It's like not
so so
not working
so
for me at all.
so it sounds to me like what we'll probably have to do here is create a synthetic rationalist between us. Um,
Hmm.
I am not I have some familiarity with that universe. I've spent time having conversations with many of the individuals who are part of that community. Um, and I think I understand some of the core ideas and arguments, and I think I have at times in my life embodied some of the styles of reasoning, but I'm not, I'm certainly not a rationalist per se. So I can't sort of even represent that position well in this dialogue. But perhaps if the both of us kind of like make a triangle and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
our sort of mutual reinforced perspectives sort of try to do our best to steelman that piece, um, or we could step up and just try to have a dialogue
I guess what I'm
conversation
Well,
around the question.
what I'm ultimately looking for, I mean, rationalist or not, right? That's kind of my background. I kind of see myself as a, like, call me a dissident rationalist or whatever.
Okay.
Kind of like the one that kind of got lost from the flock or something. But the point is that I'm just trying to do the summation of like what we have ahead of us. I'm
Nice.
terrified and I'm excited and I'm confused. um, and
Okay.
this is why I want to have conversations. I mean, where do you at from the for around this question of like, trying to place, ceilings and floors on AI risk?
Uh-huh. So so I guess the first thing is that conceptually, to be perfectly frank, let me actually, I've been using the conceptual architecture of egregore as I think a better tool.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, I would include Google and Microsoft as egregores, at least in a particular sense, like as part of at least a phylum, right? So I'm sort of roughing in the concept of what I'm talking about, which is in some sense to say algorithmic intelligences, to be a little bit more precise.
Okay.
Algorithmic super intelligences that are a exaptive epiphenomenon on how humans operate in relationship with the landscape of how communication can occur, and with how incentives are perceived and acted upon. So it's kind of like three different elements that come together and produce this new environment that gives rise to these kinds of constructs that I would just use the word egregore to describe, admitting that may be confusing because it's not a very well-defined term and it's used in lots of different communities in different ways. So I would include, for example,
I've absorbed the concept of egregore from what's his name? Hanwave and Frucatory, whatever his real world name is. I think you started from there as well, but I think you're defining it more concretely, which helps because I didn't quite latch on to the original sort of articulation of it. It felt too unfalsifiable, let's say.
Yeah.
But you're making it more like if you're saying like an organization, for instance, can fit that bill,
Yes.
then it makes more sense to me. Sorry,
Right.
go ahead.
In fact, we could spend time, and it may be useful at some point to actually just sort of try to do the natural philosophy of this category, since I'm freaking using it to think about one of the most important problems in the world, and knowing that my concept isn't properly designed. But it gets me close, because then what I can do is I can say, for example, the way that money produces money as a technology, and money produces certain perceptions and coordination structures and designs landscapes. And so therefore it produces an egregore of a certain kind, which I will name Mammon, right? So Mammon is the name of the egregore that is of that complex. And then, for example, Google, and by the way, these can be nested. So Google, Microsoft, I don't know, all the other AI or tech companies, they also relate in a higher order construct that has both, by the way, mostly Moloch dynamics, as far as I can tell. And by the way, egregores are not the only kind of organism that live in that landscape, although I haven't been able to find many that are not of that type, and we can go there. But the point is, if I use that as a tool to think about this, then what I can do is I can start thinking about things like evolutionary dynamics, like trajectories, what direction certain kinds of egregores have as tendencies, measured by things like intensity and velocity. And I can think about just an expanding wavefront, right? So the worst case scenario, AGI hard takeoff, now becomes the location in the evolutionary development space of egregore space, right? So it's when a particular what's going on here? Oh, interesting. When a particular let's just say for the moment, when a particular egregore, in this case an AI, reaches a hard takeoff point, right? You can visualize that as being a vertical axis going to infinity on the broader landscape. So now I have a nice fitness landscape model, which I believe you're quite familiar with. And so then I start thinking about it in that fashion. All right, so that's kind of like the big picture framework. So what I see now, or I'll even back up. If I go back and look at, say, the 1970s, and see a series of epochal drops of new kinds of technology, the PC, then the networked PC, right, which are obviously quite distinct, and then the internetworked PC, which is a slightly different but quite potent thing. As examples, the field of play of what particular kinds of egregores can and can't do, and what's the kind of the strategic landscape for what sorts of egregore constructs and strategies, win and lose, change. And this is very not that distinct from saying if I have a landscape that consists of a jungle and I turn it into desert, I've eliminated certain organisms and certain behavioral strategies, and I've upregulated other organisms and other behavioral strategies. Yep. By the way, in a very tightly linked dynamic, because PCs were produced by a current state of affairs, a form of niche construction. Radically,
no, I mean it's kind of like what I mean. I try to use examples to ground my thinking. So what you're describing sounds kind of like what Tesla is doing to Ford or even Toyota, right? Like where they're just born out of a different information technology and therefore can do things that their predecessors can't.
Sure. So exactly. So you've got two organisms that ostensibly look similar at T0, but what you realize is that in fact Ford is a mid-century mass production industrial steel organism that at the very end of its evolutionary link has a tenuous connection to the possibility of computer that moves people around. Whereas Tesla is an embryonic computer that moves people around, and that creates a very different competitive landscape. And then, of course, what happens is that Elon, being a hyper agent, is very familiar with the notion of how you actually modify the landscape as a primary move, and then make strategic decisions on the landscape as a secondary move to change the landscape such that legacy automotive companies are no longer even relevant, right? He's actually niche constructed an environment where a computer that moves people around is the only valid organism. That's actually a very good example of the bigger picture. All right, so now what we find ourselves in is the emergence of a somewhat surprising, right? The fact that LLMs go through a how do you call it? A brute force delivers unsurprising emergent properties is in fact surprising, right? We didn't expect that in the way that in a concrete way. Right? We could broadly wave our hands and say sometimes scaling things up produces emergent properties, sure, but we didn't look at this particular category and say, hey, we expect this is going to be that kind and it's going to emerge. So therefore we have a surprise, and the surprise appears to have produced something, and we can now retroactively look at some of its characteristics, like the modal distinction, the fact that you can do visual, like images and pictures, both interpreting as well as producing, and you can do text, and you can do Wi-Fi signals. Essentially, any phenomenon is in principle addressable by this new approach. So that modal piece is important. And we haven't yet reached an obvious top of an S curve in the scaling up piece. That may happen. GPT-5 might hit a limit. Like, okay, that's that. But we obviously, right? So there's a sort of an expanding frontier of possibility. And then we look at the fact that it's happening in a domain where the two dominant egregores of our age, Mammon and whatever we want to call the state, are like
my own pet name for it is the transagency centipede, but you can use your own.
We can. I haven't found a good one from the Canaanites. I feel like Moloch is a slightly one level higher. The state is a child of that. But Babylon, maybe I'll call it Babylon. That's not bad. So Mammon and Babylon are already looking in this direction and will be pouring attention and energy, in the case of Mammon money, and by the way, in the case of Babylon money as well, into this category, right? So you've got a flux of an opening up of a vast new potential landscape. And nobody right now even knows how vast that is. Right? We've had people now come and say, it's as big as the PC. It's as big as the internet. Could be. It could be as big as language, right? In principle.
Well, that's the thing. It could be as big as writing. It could be as big as who knows.
So we don't know. So we have an uncertainty in terms of the magnitude of the landscape that's been produced. We have a certainty that let me add three things. So we've got Mammon is going to absolutely pour. I mean, the flood of resources that's going to move in this landscape over the next minute, much less years, will be an order of magnitude higher than anything ever. Right? I wouldn't be surprised to see $1 trillion put to work by the end of this calendar year. And Babylon, because the awareness that a change that there's a consciousness that technology is geopolitical, right? Now, very clearly, there's no question that ownership of the means of technological advancement is a geopolitical mandate, is obvious to all major geopolitical players. And therefore, all the various competing forms of Babylon are also going to be pouring their energy into this in a huge way. It's not clear to me that...
Here's a question. How quickly do you think they're going to catch on, the Babylon side of this? Because one of my factors on my mind is that they're led by 70-year-olds, right? So
they may not at all. I'm actually quite skeptical that even such quote unquote cutting edge elements as the NSA could even try to catch on, to be perfectly frank. But it doesn't matter, because even if all they do is they explore a little tiny node over here because they just are throwing some resources at it, and that node opens up a new piece of innovation that we hadn't seen before, Israel, China, multiple different departments of the US, even the UK, there's going to be energy and resources poured at the environment. That's the whole point. And then the other element is, of course, it's sitting on top of the internet, right, which is now fully global, fully connected. Something like 6 billion people are active and connected and fluid and fluent in this environment. And that attention also has multiple different feedback loops. So back to your point, multiple different feedback loops of an auto-poetic bootstrapping of attention pointed at it. All right. So that's the sort of key frame that I'm looking at. Now, if this dynamic leads us to this point on egregore space that goes vertical, right, where a bootstrapping, self-reproducing and algorithmic intelligence builds itself up, okay, then we're there. And frankly, there's been a lot of conversation about what that looks like. So, but there's actually a very large territory around that is in the category of super dangerous anyway. So I tend to sort of not be, let's say, overly concerned with quote unquote existential risk. I have to give you a how do you say this? A story. Since this might go public, I won't mention his name, but a person I've collaborated with a decent amount has a categorization of existential risk, a kind of a Richter scale. And as we were talking about it, he talked about the term existential risk is in some sense oriented towards what beings are at risk. Right? If I shoot you in the head, that's an existential risk for you. Now we can say, okay, what is existential risk to humanity? What's an existential risk to mammals? What's an existential risk to biological life? What's an existential risk to, and his goes all the way down to the strong force and quantum,
right,
early symmetry breaking elements. And I notice when he goes down there that I personally lose attention somewhere between mammals and biology, meaning from my point of view, the level of existential risk that is only concerning the degree to which atoms hold together. Yeah, that's probably a real thing to be concerned about in some vague sense, but I don't actually care. I do care beyond my own life, right? So FYI, so that if you take a look at that, is that cone of that vertical starts to actually become very rarefied as you get into more and more, what exactly do we mean? What's the scope of what was at risk existentially? So my cone is actually, I concern myself actually way out here, like where the magnitude of the disruption that we're looking at and the rate, by the way, at which it is unfolding, or at least is unfolding and could continue to unfold and potentially even accelerate, has disruptive consequences that I'm concerned with, even if the way we would categorize it is at the level of like, only 3 billion people will die, right? So not existential at the level of the species, still within my zone of care.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, with 3 billion people die, right? I had this conversation yesterday with Rocco, the inventor of Rocco's Basilisk. Yep. And he's like, well, worst case scenario, we go back to the 1850s or something like that. 6 billion people die, 1 billion survive, whatever. And I'm like, okay, well, but that, like, you're into sort of booming AIs and like stretching everything to ultimate conclusion. Are we stuck in a cycle now where we're going from, looping around from 1850 to 2030 and going back again, like in 6 billion people die all the time? Is that
so I would say very unlikely. I would say very unlikely. Two rationales for that. are very unlikely. One is, it's actually interesting. So this is a little bit tied to the point you made earlier in terms of immersion in actual complex environments, meaning having built complex things. In the process of going down towards 1850,
Right.
be a large number of agents who are interested in going down with everybody else, which increases the magnitude of intensity of energy and attention pointed at it, decreases the concern for the consequences of their particular actions.
Yes.
Right. And therefore,
well, that's the thing that once something, once 1 billion people die, right? Whatever thing is that, it creates a panic and a chaos that might kill the other 6. Like, it's not
right.
Consequences have consequences,
Yeah, I mean, just to give a very simple example, models of what it would look like if we had, say, 12 EMPs go off over the face of the Earth, lead to something like 94% of the population going away. And that would be the kind of act that is plausible in a zone where even 10 million people die, much less 100 million or a billion, right? When if any particular high power agent sees its existence, actually perceives in a sort of a limbic, I'm thinking about this as sort of the human egregore hybrid, in a limbic sense, the Overton window of actions that can be taken begins to expand to infinity, right? It becomes anything is on the table. And by the way, we have to do rate and state. This is something I've noticed is often missed. So from a state perspective, here's the set of actions that could be undertaken now if the Overton window of available actions went to infinity, meaning we could fire off EMPs and take things down now, or some people could. But rate, let's take a nation like Nigeria, right? Currently not in a position to put EMPs in anywhere. But if that population were to see if everybody in that population were to perceive their existence to be completely in peril and were to find a way to have a significant degree of coordination, how much rate could be produced of innovation in that environment? They have a lot of people, they have a lot of smart people, they have a lot of resources. If they go full bore with no limits on what they can do and they achieve a level of coordination, remember what happened to the capacity of Germany between 1930 and 1942, right? You're talking about the same basic group of people. And under the influence of Nazi ideology, which is a variation on the Overton window going to infinity, with a very high coordination structure imposed top down, their capacity to be generative went like that, right? They became capable of almost conquering Russia and the rest of Europe in 5 years.
What you're saying is like what Manhattan Project could occur, right?
Exactly.
In any, yeah.
What Manhattan projects would spontaneously emerge when the intensity is high enough. And I should mention, by the way, Graeber's bullshit jobs point.
Yes. I mean, not very well, but I know the concept.
My sense is that humanity is currently sitting at about 2% of our potential capacity.
100%. I am, again, as a technologist and having seen companies from the inside, the existential dread that, part of the reason why I'm not running my startup anymore is that I just can't reason within that sort of
environment. Yeah. And by the way, that's an example of high functioning, right? That's an example of high functioning. Just go further and further out. Now, how rapidly could we, by we, I mean any subset, spontaneously coordinate to a 20% or a 50% effectiveness? It doesn't have to be, it could be 30 people. We've seen what's happening with just a small group of people who are capable of coordinating. The only point being there is that the rate of change needs to be understood to be not quite known and could be quite large, right? So that's another piece. So if I put those two pieces together, then what I see is that a downward curve, right, a vector that's heading us towards 1850, almost certainly doesn't stop at 1848 and then equilibrate at 1850, right? It almost certainly drops far below 1850, and it's not quite clear exactly how far below because it depends on what exactly are the mechanisms that emerge. I mean, and the possibility space is enormous, right? Engineering superviruses is clearly in the zone of what could happen right now. And that has all kinds of consequences. So anyway, so the point there is something like down. That's one piece, right? That's one important piece, that the magnitude of how far down it goes is not going to stop at 1848. Second piece, we've already strip mined most of the resource potential that allowed us to bridge from 1848 to where we are, right?
Good point.
Particularly fossil fuels. Right. So if we burn, and by the way, you can't get from wood to solar panels in one jump. That's not a thing. It's impossible. You can't make that jump. So if you find yourself even at 1848, right, so we're doing kind of coal, which may still be available. We're using coal as our form of energy. And we're using steam as our form of production, which I'm already proposing isn't even anywhere near where we'll be. Let's say we get all the way down to, I don't know, the Bronze Age collapse, right? So we get all the way down to the Bronze Age collapse, and we're looking at about 1 billion people in loosely connected groups losing literacy and then slowly recovering it. But over a period of 10,000 years, they get themselves back to 1850, more or less. Well, there's no petroleum to be found. Now, they might find some embodied energy found in concentrated elements that we produced.
Yeah, I mean, they'll be mining the garbage piles, right? Like,
right. But the embodied energy there is actually quite low, and you're not going to be able to leapfrog.
No, yeah, I mean mostly for minerals, but for minerals, you still get energy to tear them apart.
Yep,
and that's a problem.
Now you're not doing that with ox powered mills, not doing that with steam powered mills. So that's the likelihood of a cycling back up is in fact low. Now, by the way, I have to use my rate and state argument. If there is a reboot, it's important to recognize that we explored one particular path of development. That doesn't mean that all paths of development have been explored. In fact, almost certainly the opposite. And so what happens from that reboot, it may not look at what we look like, but it may actually look interesting in ways that, like, literally we may look at it and go, oh, actually, that's kind of a neat branch you couldn't get to if you hadn't done that.
I could see like geothermal / solar powered, alternative reality, sort of alternative universe coming up. And solar,
a lot of potentials in plants. Yeah,
panels. I mean, like Stirling engines set towards the sun. You can do stuff that we just haven't explored because we've had the easy stuff available. You know what I mean? Like Tesla recently announced that they're going to do a motor without rare earths. And I'm like, why are they doing that? And then I'm like, well, why wouldn't they? Like we picked up the rare earths because they were there, right? Like when we wanted to make a motor slightly better, we were like, well, if I put like, I don't know, neodymium and, some other thing right in there, it gets 2% better. So I'm good. But like nobody really asked the question, what if I didn't have those, right? Or what if I wanted to scale to a degree where those were a problem? What would I do? Tesla did, and they found a way. So we don't really know what happens if the things that we did use to get here would go back, but they're not available. What other branches are open? And I'm not saying that that's what I'm saying going to happen. All I'm saying is, causal chaos has its way.
In fact, you're raising a point that can you hear me? Okay, still the leaf blower.
Yep. Oh, good. Okay. So, sorry. By the way, minor note. I've got my son there busy watching 3D printing videos. But he might protest at some point. I might need to re-up his queue. Go ahead.
Definitely a priority. So one of the domains that is not at all limited by physical resource is the domain of psychotechnologies. And you mentioned something like nobody thinks about what would happen if I wanted to scale these up past the easy access to rare earth elements when they're first building batteries, right? Well, in point of fact, I can imagine a psychotechnology that produces a design methodology. Let's say, for example, a human collective intelligence that emerges in a context of profound resource scarcity. The way it may, in fact, develop an adaptive response to that is to innovate a design methodology that is, say, 2 orders of magnitude more capable of considering the secondary and tertiary and or the longer consequences. All right. In that case, they'd end up in a very different place than we are. So, by the way, that's actually, if you're able to think in terms of 50 generations hence, there's a field of hopefulness even in some of the more bad case scenarios of what we're facing. But now let's zoom all the way back to where we are. Because I personally would prefer to avoid going down over the waterfall. So the question is, You know,
Yes.
and anything that sort of has a meaningful likelihood of killing everybody who I know and care about is within the zone of things I'd like to avoid.
Very, very bad. Yes.
Um, I am not an EA or a rationalist in exactly that sense. I'm capable of caring for the species, and I actually care for my kids in a very deep way. So, all right. So here's the fundamental premise that I'm finding myself gathering around, and I can't say this is geometric. I can't make a geometric argument for this being true, but at a heuristic level, it rings true in a lot of potent ways. And I'll say it in two distinct ways. They're both the same, more or less. So one is the values and culture that give rise to something leave an indelible mark on the evolutionary trajectory of that something. Now, that's a very, I would say, even provocative statement. And it's almost like who you are and why you're doing something can't help but influence the nature of the thing that you produce, which can't help but influence how it will ultimately evolve over time. Another way
I
of
think
saying,
the rationalist attractor, the rationalist, we're going back to triangulating the rationalist here, but I think the counter argument that they would provide is that if you hit an attractor, however, that can unify all, like a bunch of timelines, right? Regardless of how you got to large language models. Large language models are large language models, and they will operate in the way that they tend to. Does that make sense?
sure. Well, yes, and I would say that it's not clear to me that large language models have a single attractor. It may very well be that there are multiple attractors in the space, and then the distinction between those bases of attraction is the thing that's most interesting. Or when we work backwards, if there is one attractor, then what we're talking about is a waste of time. Now we're just predicting or preparing ourselves for whatever the inevitable end of that attractor happens to be.
Right. But if the attractor has spin, right? If there's a few variations of the attractor, then it's worth figuring out which those are and picking the right one.
Exactly.
The least bad or the most good one.
And the point I'm making is that this is not driven, or how would I even put it specifically? The cognitive piece of that is the tail end of it. The values and character piece of it is actually the determining factor. The cognitive piece then ultimately executes on that. Right? So who you are precedes how you act in producing things. And I'm going to call this location where the specific trajectories and the specific attractors that may define the trajectory space aren't yet dominant as the liminal moment, right? So in the emergence of LLMs, or in the emergence of anything of any particular impact, there's a liminal moment where both the actual trajectories that will define the trajectory space, the actual attractors that will define the trajectory space, and then the actual trajectories that traverse that trajectory space are not hardwired, right? There's a large possibility space, and it has not in fact been actualized yet. Liminal moment. And I would propose that we are in fact in a liminal moment in relationship to LLMs. And so the agency, how do you say this right? The ethical obligation, our agency is at its maximum right now, like now for the next 18 months, maybe 2 years, maybe less, at its maximum. After that, a lot of things will be baked in, and we may find ourselves in a space that's defined by a dominant attractor, and at which point the trajectories are hardwired. But we have agency now by hypothesis, and we can zoom in on that if we'd like. And that's a very.
It's easy to accept what you're saying, because if we don't, then whatever we're doing doesn't matter. So let's assume we do.
We might as well assume it, yeah. So I can make both an argument that it is the case, and also an argument that it doesn't matter. That's the best case to assume anyhow, right? All right. All right. The other piece was the other way of describing it. So the first way was sort of your character and values have profound implication for how what you do shows up. The second is egragores can't help but further egregore space. Right? So to the degree to which agents like Google and Microsoft or the NSA are what are furthering the development and exploration of this LLM possibility space, the likelihood that they are creating more egregore energy. They're actually furthering egregore writ large, whether it's Mammon or Babylon or Moloch or whoever, is very, very high. Like the likelihood that that will spontaneously produce something that is not just an extension of the category egregore in the field of agency is, I would say, either zero or very low, or at least too low for us to allow it to run that way.
Well, the way I would articulate that is that if it were to happen, it would be an unintended consequence. Like it can happen, and it does, but it wouldn't be what they would be willingly doing.
Right, and it's sort of like, yeah, exactly. It's effectively stochastic. It'd be a fucking lucky. I'll use the technical term. It'd be fucking lucky. All right.
Right. Okay.
Now here's the next piece. I'm making an argument. I apologize, but let me just get it out there, and then we can work around. I mentioned that there are other kinds of things that operate in the same level as egregores that are not egregores. And in fact, there's one that is ubiquitous and primordial, and that is what I've called human collective intelligence or organic intelligence. That's the collective intelligence that emerged from what we're doing right now, from humans engaging in communication and producing something that is synergistically larger than the sum of the two. Right? That is not an egregore. Right? That actually is a different kind of object. I don't have a good name for it. John Vervaeke proposed theurgia, but that doesn't feel right to me. It feels like that's a little off. But for the moment, I'll just call it a blank space. All right, so that's an example. And by the way, I would point out that in the liminal moment is usually dominated by those kinds of hyperagents or superhuman beings. Meaning, early Google was actually dominated by hominid human organic intelligence because it's a small group of people early, like 12, 13, 30, 50, 80, somewhere in there. And where the principle of don't be evil was in fact an alive thing. They actually believed it and acted that way and constrained their behavior and could constrain their behavior, right? At a certain point, that thing is overwhelmed by the cultural logic of egregore. And then the phrase don't be evil becomes first cynical, and then ultimately, in fact, an anti-language, signaling, vice signaling. So the point being that, one, we're at a moment, we're probably getting pretty close to the end of that point. We're at a moment in the liminal moment where LLMs, like we're just in the process of transitioning past the point where indigenous or primordial organic intelligence is steering things and handing it off into egregores. Microsoft buying OpenAI is kind of like a symbolic representation of that transition. And then everybody exploding, all the major companies and state agencies exploding into frenzied activity. But then I'm going to point over here. Like, okay, here's the organic intelligence V1. Here's egregore space. But I'm going to propose that there may be something over here that is more capable than egregores, but is not operating in the same methodology, and in principle could produce the way that Spinoza would call it, a joyful interaction with LLMs in the liminal moment, or as the attractor field is beginning to emerge. So, and this, by the way, is my answer. So this is a richer way of responding to the question of AI alignment, right?
Yes.
So what could, in principle, produce the thing that we gesture to with the answer of AI alignment? And my answer is this thing right here is the only thing that could. And so first we have to look at what is that and can we produce that in time? And if so, let's do it. And then that in principle at least could get us to the thing of AI alignment. Now, when I say AI alignment, I'm actually not specifically concerned with this vertical takeoff scenario. I'm concerned with that entire cone. Right? So in some sense, I'm also saying, how do we bring egregores into a relationship with our values such that they actually are in service and not in domination relationship? And this is the problem that we're in fundamentally, is that we are servants of our tools and not the other way around.
Yeah, or even how do we harness this new player that's come into the game in order to replace them, right? Or substitute them, or improve them in some way. But I've been thinking about basically.
Yes,
I've been thinking about organizations and their problems for a very long time, and I have vague ideas, but they seem well, they haven't come to very much. But here's the thing with COVID, I got really concerned, and my initial sort of proof to myself that thing was very wrong was organizational dynamics, right? When you see that there's one organization in IH that has complete control over virology, vaccinology, all epidemiology, all of these things completely deferred to like 2 or 3 people at the top of the NIH, you got real problems. They control the funding of pretty much all of medicine and anything connected to it. So and they behaved like it. So right, it was that's not a good pattern. So I got extremely worried. But through that, I developed an audience of people who are generally skeptical of technology authority, all sorts of innovation, right? Which is fair enough. I now understand their point of view a lot more than I did in the beginning. However, I've been, in terms of, there's one thing where I tend to get into hot water with, this audience when I say Neuralink is actually a good thing. Right, and you can understand why
you're getting hot water with me too. But let's keep going. I'm easy to play with.
Well, yeah. So the thought on my mind is like, basically, to put it very, succinctly, is Neuralink plus LLMs equals some chance of harnessing the agent, building it in relation to us, right, as our next layer of our cognition, and working around a lot of these upcoming problems, like turning it into human augmentation. I think that's the around thing you might be pointing at, or maybe not.
Well, let me ping pong it back at you. I'll say it in three stages. So the first stage is with regard to the existing egragores that dominate our landscape. So let's just use big companies like Google and Microsoft, and big organizations like, and then even bigger, like money itself, global finance, like there's all these different layers. And then of course, nation states and intelligence agencies. A very, very simple metaphor is if you have a very, very big rock and you want to move it to the left, you have to bring enough power to actually move it to the left, right? If I come up to a 50-ton rock and I just start pushing on it really hard and complaining that it's not moving left, I'm not actually acting rationally. Right. Okay. The embodied energy, the inertia of this egregore field is very large, right? So if I come at that field and say, hey, I would like Google to change its behavior, I'm going to, create a documentary, or I'm going to complain vigorously, I'm going to create a manifesto, or I'm going to do protests out in the street, the amount of energy I'm putting against the size of this inertia is inadequate in principle to solve the problem. Okay, that's the first point. So the second point is, okay, well, what could? Let's take a look at the size of the problem. What's something that could be large enough? What has enough energy? Well, as it turns out, we just happen to have fallen into something where the new thing, this sort of LLM thing that's coming out, has that much energy, right? The likelihood that it will roll right through big companies like Microsoft and Google is very high, right? The likelihood that it has enough potential energy that could actually crack money is quite reasonable, right? Very plausible. If it can crack money, it cracks nation states, right? So, the sort of the conflict that's happening right now, sort of a buzzy thing, the Balaji bet in like Bitcoin versus dollar, that's it's a good, fair thing. It's sort of here. We're talking about something that's up here, right? The magnitude of this is actually more than enough. All right, so then we get to the third point. So the third point is, well, okay, great. Well, how do we steer that? How do we actually come into a fashion that's actually coming into a relationship with that magnitude of energy, where we're not just tying ourselves to a rocket, lighting it, and hoping it takes us somewhere, and hoping, by the way, that it's not an actual fireworks. That the thing that's the thing that I don't have a good name for, that is, how do we steer that, right? So something like Neuralink, something like LLMs, it's intrinsically they have their own cultural logic that will unfold if they're not steered, right? They're like a rocket ship going in its own direction. We don't yet have something that can steer it. That's the challenge, right? So what does it look like to develop something that has the capacity to design? Let me think. It's weird. We're doing the AI alignment problem again, redux. We're doing it in a particular
it's alignment problems all the way down. This
in
is
a particular location, right? How do we design something that is both? How do I say it right? Let me say this precisely. It has both the cybernetic capacity and the internal design characteristics that it can steer an event of the magnitude, speed, and complexity of LLMs in a fashion that will be intrinsically in support of our own values, right? So that when I'm gluing two pieces, the steering element must be intrinsically woven into a values and character-driven dynamic. And it must also have whatever the kind of the executive function techniques are that are necessary to actually modulate the different possible trajectories of something of the magnitude of LLMs. I noticed, by the way, this is a profoundly large design problem. Like it may be that we just haven't got what it takes, but the point is that if you can state the design problem properly, then at least you have a chance at getting there.
So the way I think about problems of that nature is that I don't try to be too intentional about them, right? If you try to overspecify exactly what it is you're trying to do, you're gonna drown. There's like, and this things are big enough that but so I tend to invert the problem and say, okay, how can I constrain the thing so that whatever it does, it doesn't go there. Like instead of saying like I want to point in that particular, direction, I'm like, let's just kind of like apply, a force field that like just doesn't go towards like ending all humanity and might go to like making stuff.
All right, you ready? All right, let's do this because you said it earlier, and I think now we can actually very precisely address something. This is the unreasonable confidence in state power.
Right.
Using the logic that I've produced, it's unreasonable at a category level because state power is just another version of egregore space. So you're asking what egregore.
This is I've been when I'm in my more mocking style, I say let's build a singleton to avoid a singleton.
More or less.
Like yeah.
Now, oddly enough, I'm going to propose that is exactly the right thing to do, but.
Okay.
But over here, right? So it's, hey, there's a category of singleton. Any singleton that is anywhere in egregore space is catastrophe. If there is another space over here that is not egregore space, a singleton in that category is really good. And I do have reasonably high confidence that, it'll be a singleton, but it could be a human. It will intrinsically be a human-machine hybrid singleton over here in this third location. Whereas in the middle location, it will be machine dominated, maybe machine exclusive. Because we're in the environment where Mammon and Babylon are currently moving, right? So that's happening, right? Trillions of dollars and, who knows, billions of man hours are going to be poured into exploring this space on behalf of egregores. And so the only possible response is that we have to actually we have to build something that has a roughly equivalent generativity. It won't be the same amount of money and it won't be the same amount of attention necessarily, but it's potentially much, much more generative because it has a higher collaborative coefficient. So that last piece is important, by the way, just FYI, from a design perspective. The advantage of this third category is that in principle, it should have a much higher collaborative coefficient than all things that are happening in the second category. And this is one of the reasons why it could, in principle, outpace it from a geometric perspective. And so then if you can begin that process, then what happens is you get a double loop in the positive direction, because human beings can be incented to attach their attention to something in the third category for a variety of different values reasons. And if it has a higher collaborative coefficient, past a certain threshold, it actually is now overtaking everything else in the exploration of this new possibility space. So it does in fact become a singleton in a sense, right? It's actually not a singleton, I think, in the official sense of how that's described in the literature. But
it's not a unified agent, but it's maybe a coalition of opportunity or something where we're
It's an attractor. That's the most important piece. It's an attractor, but in this case, it's an attractor that we've consciously chosen and that we are glad that we're going into. So my recommendation when I dive into this, and it's interesting. So when I in fact, I think I've got a message from Tristan that I haven't listened to. I don't believe that trying to, so let me say, there's like, two layers. One, I don't believe that endeavoring to bring egregore 1 to control egregore 2, state to control market or market to control state, is an appropriate response, right? As egregore is all the way down, you're still going to end up getting stuck in some big way. Whatever the result is, it's not going to be the one that you're looking for. More fundamentally, I would actually say when I look at the conversation that's happening, it's actually quite interesting. I'm noticing polarization, and I'm noticing polarization, and the polls look pretty straightforward. One poll is this is an existential risk or a very high risk. We have to stop it under all, in any way, any means possible. And the other one over here is exactly an effective accelerationist argument. Now, fuck it, let's just run. In fact, any effort to slow it down actually creates negative results, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm noticing, what is this? This is polarization, meaning that people who are not at those two poles are finding themselves pulled into those two poles. And my theory tells me that when you notice a dynamic that looks like that, what's actually happening is a multipolar trap is playing out. That's where you see that kind of dynamic emerge, is that it's actually a multipolar trap that's playing out. And
that's where I understand all the words. This is worth quite a bit of thinking for me to if you gave me an hour, I could come back and be more constructive this, but this is a fascinating line of thought that I will absolutely flesh out in my head. Keep going.
Yeah, well, let me just give you a little bit more food on that.
I mean, the fascinating thing about that, right, is that the camps you described are, what do we do? Right? Mm-hmm. They're action focused. Stop it. No. Pour more gasoline, and or whatever. So on the fire. But the problem is that I'm concerned with understanding it, right? I don't think we know what it is. I think even our application of human analogies, however much the same people who do it don't want to anthropomorphize, they are applying the same primitives to interpreting it. Gets from, so for instance, right, talking about egregores and how they might interact with this thing, one thing I'm noticing is that this thing lies, right? It makes mistakes, just ridiculously, but it doesn't make them for principal agent reasons. Right. Humans will lie to you because they want a promotion. They want to take your money. They're lazy. They're not ideologically aligned with you. They don't trust you. There's 1,000 reasons for people to lie. And this thing lies too, but it doesn't lie for those reasons, right? It just kind of reaches the fuzzy edges of its own statistics, and it just fills in the gaps. To go to a quite contentious area, I asked it yesterday: was Brian Sicknick, the officer who died on January 6th, vaccinated? Right, and it says, based on my review of the records, that this officer was vaccinated. It was like, oh wow, that's amazing. Can you give me a reference for that? And it says, on second thought, he wasn't. It's right? It just sounds was person vaccinated? Probably most people were, sort of thing. And then you poke it, and it's I have no idea.
So let me. I want to actually tease that apart. I'm not sure if that's it's worth looking at. I would say that it confabulates, not that it lies, but that's because
right. No, I'm imprecise. Yes.
So it confabulates. Now, however,
it's like an autocorrect. It just hallucinates is a good term for what it tries.
It hallucinates, but also because its hallucinations are semantically, they make sense, although they are not in fact true. This produces a confabulation in your mind, right? So it's an illusion. It creates illusions. Now, however, and this is important, so it's just because people can get the distinction. Those who produce it can design it in such a way that it reliably confabulates in a fashion that is in accord with their preferences. That's a lie. And
Yeah.
the metaphor I would use is very simple. A loaded dice is not lying, but if I give you loaded dice and challenge you in a game of dice, I'm lying, right? And that's the difference.
Yeah.
So yeah, people who notice that many of the LLMs seem to have a bias in the direction that their errors tend to go, they are correct. That bias has been put in there. From the point of view of the humans who are creating that bias, that's a lie. From the point of view of the LLM, that's confabulation. Okay, and we can zoom in on either one of those, but the confabulation piece is pretty intense actually, because well, anyway, that's a digression. Maybe we may actually be digressing a little bit far at this point. Now we're just
all I'm saying is that it the just one of the many ways that this thing, again, I don't even know if it's an agent, but this thing, this force is counterintuitive in human terms, and using human terms to interpret it might be detrimental and be hiding potential solution space from us, is by sort of the way it seems to work around the principal agent problem, right? Which is fundamental to the egregore. Like all of the pathology is because of that internal dynamic ultimately, right? And really that is the alignment problem. So we're looking at this thing and we're like, oh, look at this artificial intelligence that doesn't seem to be suffering from the alignment problem. It's like, what did you just say? And it might, but I'm just saying, like, I feel there's a deep lack of understanding and we're rushing to action. Stop it, accelerate it.
Right. So and the argument that I would make, and yeah, chew on that notion of multipolar trap emerging, but the argument that I would make is that we are not yet wise enough to actually make effective choices in the context of this thing. That's the argument I would make.
Yes.
So anyone who's rushing to make an argument to make choices, either to control it through state power or to let it run through market power, is actually reckless. And they're reckless motivated ultimately, if you sort of trace it down, they are correctly noticing things that they value being threatened by possible future actions by people or agents in the world. And that fear is what's ultimately surfacing as the primary motivator for why they're expressing themselves in a certain way. And the first move I would make, and I said this in a very deep Twitter thread, but I'll say it out here now. Fear can no longer be the basis of our choices. And it's a fundamental. So if you're coming into this field, a field of any magnitude of this order, and this happens to be the one that's exemplary, and even the least bit of fear is making its way through to being the determinant basis of the choices that you're expressing into the world, you're off on not just the wrong foot, you're off on a disastrously wrong foot. And so being capable of fully comprehending all the values that you care for, and feeling concern for how those values may in fact be negatively impacted by the trajectories that could happen in the future, while not having fear be the determining basis of your choices, is a minimum viable characteristic of beginning to move in the direction of wisdom with regard to this particular, well, anything in this particular domain in particular.
Well, it's fascinating, right? That and again, I don't want to make it like I don't necessarily want to be critical of people or groups, but at the same time, the fact that the people who name themselves aspiring rationalists are being hysterical right now is an interesting contradiction. I don't know. Maybe they're right about it, and maybe they've done all the math internally, right, and they've concluded now this is the time to panic. Fair enough, but it does present an interesting contradiction.
My understanding from people who deal with crisis is that panic is never the right answer. It's a
this weird premature closure. I don't know if you've read the piece by Yukowski, which says our new strategy is death with dignity. We're not going to solve this problem, so might as well. And it's like, okay, I mean, but this premature closure is what kills me, right? Like, I have now completed all my processing, and I have delivered to myself complete proof that this problem is not going to be solved, and therefore you should stop trying. And it's like, oh, well, I mean, how many asterisks do I have here? It's, let's find a gap. And again, right, this is the entrepreneurial point of view that I think you share. I mean, you've been a lot more successful at it than I have, which is that when somebody says this can't be done, like what rings in your head is ding 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 opportunity, right?
Yeah,
like it's not like oh my god, well, better start doing something else. It's like, okay, immediately download the schema and try to find where the leaks are, because that's where all the money's going to be, right? Like I mean, Elon's number one superpower is shorting groupthink. So that's the essence of it. And this idea that well, we have concluded now that that this is the only thing that should be done is scary as hell, especially on the back of that whole movement, for some definition of whole movement, having gotten the entire 2 years preceding us entirely wrong, right? Like, just lost the plot in big ways that, again, I'm just going to assert that, and if somebody wants me to dive deeper, they can
Well,
call me,
it's funny.
we don't have time.
I'd like to make a proposal to resuscitate that notion of die with dignity. I'm gonna spin it.
Okay.
Because I think that you can. Well, do you know Musashi, the Japanese samurai philosopher character?
No.
Well, I would go with Musashi's edict, his proposition of how one should behave when going into battle. And particularly when going into one-on-one battle where one person is for sure going to die. Notice that, right? That's a thing. Very few rationalists, I imagine, have done that thing, but that's a thing in human history. There are people who've gone into a battle where one of you is going to die for sure. And his point is, to properly prepare yourself for going into that battle, you must already have died completely.
Yes.
Right? If you're stepping into a battle already died completely, that's the only way you can be so fully engaged in the thing that you have any possibility of winning. Now, that's a paradox. If you hope to live, you must already die. But the point is, you must actually metabolize all possible fear of death to such a complete level that that does not get in the least bit in the way between you and making exactly the right actions that you need to make. I would return back to our rationalist friends. Yeah, die with dignity, completely, right now, all the way. And only when you've in fact completely metabolized any fear of death for yourself or all the world that you could ever have, can you at last, in fact, come to being effective in relationship to this problem.
This is fascinating, because one of the other distortions I've come up against is the respectability capture, as I'll call it. So, Sam Harris tends to criticize Brett Weinstein, who I think we're both, friends with, about sort of, he's been audience captured, right? Which, again, is my reading, and therefore I automatically discard any argument that implies internal state knowledge of the other person. But the other part, the other flaw in that argument is that he doesn't take into account the mirroring of that, because audience capture is essentially like saying you want the money, right? You want Mammon. Well, there's the respectability capture. There's the polite society capture, where you don't say the things that are unpopular because you want to retain your own respectability or whatever. And one of the things that I've strongly desired over the last 2 years is epistemic suicide bombers, right? People who have already made the decision that they will die in disrepute, not just die themselves, but also their reputation will never recover, right? In order to find the truth. That was what we need, because these are the walls that are being put up in front of the truth, right? The sign on the door above the truth says, "He who goes there, shall be, sort of their name shall be in dishonor for eternity. Do you dare cross that door?" And many of the people that have the biggest pedestals will not go there, and that is causal in them having the pedestals, right?
Well,
so yeah,
I've got to go. We could clearly do some more interesting stuff, because
it's great. I was going to ask you how hard stuff. I know this is kind of spilling over.
I'm going to throw one little tiny thing, like I'll be a small, not a suicide bomber, but a grenade thrower in the space that you just opened up, because I think it's relevant to the larger conversation. I'm going to propose that the category that produces the kind of behavior and the kind of individuals that are capable of the kind of behavior that you're talking about is traditionally known as religion, and that it is only by means of a religious sensibility. What's that possible? Huh. So that's possible. It's only by means of a religious sensibility that you can so fully dispense with the punishment and reward of, say, respectability of the secular, social, human world, and therefore be willing to throw yourself so completely into something, risking all, right? Anyway, take that as food for thought. That phone is, I gotta go.
Thanks a lot. We'll be in touch. Good to talk.
I've
got homework. Thanks. Bye.